Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome, and we're back after the long seasonal break. I think it's been 4 or 5 weeks without UFC. We finally get a UFC event this weekend at UFC Vegas 84. I hope everybody has had a fantastic Christmas, a great New Year, and excited to be getting back to the sport that we love in 2024. I know I am, and I cannot wait for this card. It probably didn't matter the quality of this card, the first one in January. I just want to see UFC back there on my screens. I missed the Saturday nights, and we're getting it right back this weekend. But just before we get started, if you do want to jump in on the action this weekend at MMA Play 365, we've got plenty of options for you. Dog of the Week, we've got next event subscription, a monthly subscription. If you want to sign up annually, that's only $99 as well. That's all at MMAplay365.com, where you'll get the betting advice from myself. You'll also get the Baze AI UFC predictions included in every single package in regards to the next event, the monthly and the annual, so you get everything in one place. We've got some brand new features coming in 2024, starting from this event from Baze AI as well, where the AI is automatically generating and calculating the top 6 predictions for the straight win-loss, for the win-loss plus method of victory, so that's your knockout, submission or decision, and your win-loss method of victory plus round as well. So for example, that'll be fighter A to win by knockout in round 1. The top 6 of each of those 3 categories is going to be available easily, readily on the betting hub. So if you do want to join the action, get involved this weekend at UFC Vegas 84, and that's all on MMAplay365.com. And now we're going to get straight into the breakdowns, because at the top of the card, the main event and the co-main event, we've got 2 rematches as well. Interesting rematches for very different reasons. And we're going to start, of course, as always, with the main event. We've got Magomed Ankalaev versus Johnny Walker 2. Now, like I said, this is a rematch from not that long ago. There was the controversial knee to the face, and, so much went round on social media about Johnny Walker. People were claiming, or some were claiming, that he was out. The doctor didn't clear him to continue, but then there was claims of the doctor asking Johnny Walker ridiculous questions to try and gain where he was at from a consciousness perspective, but questions that, a lot of fighters, especially in that moment with the adrenaline after just being kneed illegally in the face, probably wouldn't be able to answer, and then called the fight because of that. And it was really disappointing, because the fight was just getting interesting at that point as well. Like, you go back and watch the fight, there's only a couple of minutes of it, 2 to 3 minutes. It's a bit of back and forth with the strikes. Johnny Walker landed some hard low kicks, Ankalaev looking like he wants to box, but then Ankalaev looked like he hurt Johnny Walker to the body. I don't know if Johnny Walker was playing possum to try and land the flying knee, which he did afterwards. He sort of crouched down from the body shot, and then once Ankalaev came in thinking it hurt him, he tried to throw a flying knee, missed. Ankalaev took him down, and Ankalaev was just controlling the position against the cage. Johnny Walker was struggling to get back up. Ankalaev was doing a good job of just smothering and controlling wrist and controlling a leg and just landing strikes. And then, of course, Ankalaev postured up a little bit and then landed that knee, and that was all she wrote. And that's pretty much exactly how the fight went. And to be honest, I will be honest, I can't remember how I broke that last fight down. I didn't and won't go back to that podcast where I broke the fight down, but I would imagine it was pretty much somewhere along the lines of, look, I think Magomed Ankalaev technically on the feet is a better striker, but he's got massive advantages with the wrestling and grappling. Now, I kind of feel that, look, I'm on the same page with this rematch as well, and it's interesting because if you go back and look at the closing odds, Ankalaev closed at around minus 360 from what I'm seeing, and at the minute he's currently about minus 450, minus 500. So there's a reason why, even though we only saw a few minutes, why Ankalaev is now a bigger favourite than what he closed at during the previous fight. And I think it's because it was made obvious that, look, if Ankalaev does wrestle and grapple in this fight, then I think he's got a very clear and comfortable path to victory, because I don't think Johnny Walker can compete on bottom with Ankalaev on top. And it's a really strange one, because before Ankalaev came into the UFC, he was a heavy wrestler, and then suddenly You know, he seems to have fallen in love with his strike, and he uses his wrestling more opportunistically, more sporadically, and I actually think it's a detriment to him as a fighter because he's such a good wrestler and grappler, and he's a better wrestler and grappler than the majority of the division, and this is where he's going to get wins against the real top level guys. Now, if he stands and strikes with Johnny Walker, there's two things here. One, it's going to be much closer. The fight will be much closer than it could be. And secondly, it's just going to give Johnny Walker opportunities to land something hard on Ankalaev. I don't think he's going to knock him out, but at the same time, you can't really rule that out at light heavyweight, especially when you've got someone that is as explosive as Walker and hits as hard as Walker. You can never really rule that out, but Ankalaev's tough, and it is tough to imagine him going out and getting knocked out. You know, he's just that tough Russian. I genuinely think it's just a tough fight for Johnny Walker. Again, I think Ankalaev can be relatively comfortable on the feet striking. If it's a 25-minute kickboxing fight, I still think Ankalaev probably wins, but it's just a lot closer than what it would be if he doesn't mix in his wrestling and grappling. If he mixes in his wrestling and grappling, it's going to be a pretty simple fight. But all in all, I do think Ankalaev is still the better technical striker that will do better work on the feet throughout the 5 rounds, but then you add in the wrestling and grappling as well. If he does mix that in, which you always have to anticipate that he's going to because of the level of wrestler and grappler that he is, then that makes this fight, you know, become a little bit more far apart. So for those reasons, I'm picking Magomed Ankalaev to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, another rematch. We've got Matheus Nicolau versus Manel Kape 2. Now, again, this is a really interesting rematch, but it's a really interesting rematch for a different reason than the main event. So these two guys have fought before. They fought 3 rounds. Nicolau won the fight. It was a split decision. It was close. It was one of those fights where we had all the Manel Kape backers saying that he got robbed. We had Matheus Nicolau backers saying that, you know, he deservedly won and, you know, it shouldn't have gone any other way. And it was just one of those fights that, in my opinion, was really close. It could have gone either way. I did actually bet Matheus Nicolau in that fight as an underdog. And look, I'm sitting here just as a realist and just saying, look, it was a very close fight. You stick 3 different judges 10 times over in that same fight and you'll come out with all kinds of different results. You'll come out with Nicolau wins, Kape wins, split decisions, unanimous decisions on either side, 30-27s, 29-28s. I'm sure it was just a very, very close fight, and it was Nicolau that, you know, got the better of Kape on the judges' scorecards on that specific night. Now, again, when it comes to the betting lines and the odds, it's really interesting to reflect of where the odds were last time and where the odds are now, considering what we've already seen. Now, with Matheus Nicolau, like I said, I bet him as an underdog. I think I took around plus 125 last time, and that's roughly where he closed as well. Some places he closed at plus 100, plus 110, but Matheus Nicolau was an underdog. Now, it's really interesting because as an underdog, he cashed as a win of a split decision, and now the rematch, numerous fights later, Matheus Nicolau's now sitting at around plus 200 at some bookies. So even though he's already beaten Manel Kape, you've got to ask yourself the question, well, why is Nicolau now a 2-1 underdog against Manel Kape, a fighter that he's already beaten? And I think it's a mixture of Manel Kape. When he fought Matheus Nicolau, it was his second fight in the UFC. His first fight was the current flyweight champion in Pantoja. I actually bet Pantoja, I believe, as an underdog in that fight as well. And then I bet Nicolau as an underdog against Kape the fight after. So I actually bet against Kape in his opening 2 fights. And one of the reasons why is I feel that he just wasn't settled into the UFC yet. He came straight in with a lot of hype from Rising, I believe, and he just fought the best of the best straight away without even getting his foot in the door properly. So that was one of the reasons. But since those 2 back-to-back losses, he stepped down in competition a few times in a row and has fought, you know, lower level competition. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but like Pantoja's the current champion and Nicolau's, you know, a legitimate ranked fighter. But he took a step down in competition, found his way in the UFC, got comfortable, and I feel that he's built himself and developed himself to a UFC caliber fighter between that last Nicolau fight and the Nicolau fight that we're going to see on the weekend. I think that we're just going to see a better version of Kape now than what we saw last time out. And look, I'll be honest, I don't agree with the betting line at all. I don't think that Nicolau should be a plus 200 underdog in this fight. I still think that Nicolau's really dangerous. He's still got power in his hands. He's got a brutal low kick. He's got good takedowns. His Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is world class. He's a black belt, and we saw that Kape was taken down in their last fight, and there was a relatively sized discrepancy between the top side game of Nicolau and the bottom game of Manel Kape, and that's still a path to victory for Nicolau. So although I don't agree with the betting line, I genuinely believe it should be a lot closer. But where I picked Nicolau and was confident in Nicolau last time in regards to just simply winning the fight, I'm the other way this time with Manel Kape. And one of the reasons why is I don't like Nicolau's output so much. So he's very much a reactive fighter. He's a fighter that will, wait for his opponents to go first. He won't pour out a ton of volume. He won't force the action and force the pace of the fight. And it's kind of one of those things where you're watching him fight and you're begging him to go on and go forwards and put it on his opponents, but he won't. He's very reactive and he's very calculated with what he throws. But that can be a detriment to him as a fighter, especially with someone like Kape who will pour volume on. He will be active, he will be aggressive, he will come forwards. And it's kind of one of those fights where Kape's going to get the forward pressure and the opportunity to land a ton of volume that he wants, but Matheus Nicolau is also going to get the fight he wants as well, because he's going to be pulling Kape into his own strikes. It's just I don't think that Nicolau's going to be able to do the damage on Kape to be able to switch at least the judges' views of the fight of, okay, well, Nicolau's now hurting Kape with everything he throws, which is going to outdo the volume and the aggression game of Kape, what he's providing in the fight. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think that Kape's volume and aggression is going to outweigh what Nicolau's throwing, because I don't think Nicolau can just hurt Kape every time he counter strikes, and I feel like that's what Nicolau's got to do to be able to win a decision here, especially from a striking perspective. Then when it comes to the grappling, I still think that Nicolau's going to have a significant advantage over Manel Kape if he gets the fight down. But again, it's how successful is the wrestling going to be, because to get the top side grappling going, you've got to get your wrestling going. And if Manel Kape's the one that's been aggressive coming forwards and hitting Nicolau a lot, then Nicolau's going to really struggle to level change and hit successful takedowns. I do think he might get one or two in this fight. It might come in the first round, but I really do think that Kape in this specific fight is going to be the one that's going to slowly start taking over the longer the fight goes on, just accumulate more volume. And it does strike me as one of those fights where a fighter loses a split decision early on in his UFC career, comes back and rematches a little bit later when he's found his feet and really puts on a solid performance. Like I said, I don't think there's going to be enough of the successful wrestling and then, of course, the successful long-term grappling in this fight for Matheus Nicolau to really do well down the stretch. I think it's going to be Kape that's, doing the good work on the feet. That's where the majority of the action's going to be, and that should be where the fight's won and lost. And again, I just think the volume, the power, the combinations that Kape puts together is going to outweigh what Matheus Nicolau does on the feet. And for those reasons, I'm picking Manel Kape to win this fight. And in the next fight, this should be a fun one for as long as it lasts. Between two veterans in the UFC, we've got Jim Miller versus Gabriel Benitez. And like I say, in my opinion, it's a really fun fight. It's a well-matched fight as well. Jim Miller is a fighter that even at the old age, he's got over the Lyme disease and all that sort of stuff. The amount of respect that you have to have for a fighter like Jim Miller is just insane. And he's still doing it at this level in the UFC. He's still got power in his hands. He's still a world class grappler. It's just with Jim Miller, he will face a certain level of opponent at this level where he's going to struggle against. But I don't think Gabriel Benitez is that level of opponent that where Jim Miller's going to go in there and he's just going to get ran through. At the same time, Gabriel Benitez isn't a level of opponent that hasn't got experience and Jim Miller's just going to run through them, because we've seen that from Jim Miller. He's been that gatekeeper type of fighter where the UFC have put somebody who's relatively new in the UFC against him, and Jim Miller's just ran through them just because, he is the experienced veteran inside the cage. But here, both fighters have got a ton of experience in the UFC. Obviously, Jim Miller's got more, but Gabriel Benitez, like I say, I don't think he's a significant amount better than Jim Miller. I don't think he's a significant amount worse than Jim Miller. I just think it's going to be a really good fight. I think from a striking perspective, Gabriel Benitez is going to be trying to batter Jim Miller up with the kicks, but Jim Miller's fought fighters where they've had good low kicks and a good varied striking game, but when Jim Miller starts putting his boxing together and then mixes in his own kicks as well, he does a really good job of nullifying aggressive fighters, and that's where I categorise Gabriel Benitez. He's a very aggressive striker, comes forward, powers kicks to the legs, to the body. We've heard it a billion times before from the commentators and the AKA coach that Gabriel Benitez is the hardest kicker that they've ever seen in the gym and all that sort of stuff. We've heard it so many times over his career, but whether he is the hardest kicker genuinely that they've ever felt kicking that gym, or whether they're just trying to hype it up, he still has very hard kicks, and Jim Miller's got to respect that. But the thing is, Jim Miller's got a wrestling background. He's a legit BJJ black belt, so he's got that in his back pocket. I just think in this fight, Jim Miller's got more ways to win. Gabriel Benitez can only win on the feet, and that's a legitimate path to victory for someone like Gabriel Benitez, because he's a dangerous striker, and if he does start to beat up the legs of Miller, the old body of Miller, and starts to land some shots to the head, I wouldn't say Miller's durability's gone in his old age, but it definitely won't be what it used to be. So, look, Gabriel Benitez's striking is a path to victory for sure, and the fight, the last time I saw it, was a close -110 pick'em on either side pretty much, so the public are very divided and split in this fight, and I think with Jim Miller, like I said, I just always, in these types of fights where the striking's going to be relatively close between the fighter that is a predominant striker and the fighter that's an all-rounder, I tend to lean more towards the all-rounder fighter, because if the striking doesn't quite go how they want against the predominant striker, then at least they've got a second path to victory with the wrestling and grappling, and that's where I see this fight for Jim Miller. I think the striking's close. I think Miller could beat Benitez on the feet, but if it's not quite going for Miller striking on the night, which can happen, then Miller's got a plan B, and that's what I like here. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jim Miller to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Ricky Simón versus Mario Bautista, and it's a really well-matched fight, this. I really like it stylistically. I see what the UFC are trying to do. Look, Ricky Simón came off a pretty, I wouldn't say a bad performance against Song Yadong, because that sort of infers that Ricky Simón underperformed, but when I say bad performance, it was just a clinic by Song that he'd hurt Ricky Simón a few times, defended against the wrestling, then ended up knocking him out. This is a significant step down in competition, but again, from the paper, when you look at this fight on paper, from the paper perspective, shall we call it, it does look like the UFC are trying to set up Ricky Simón for a banana skin type of fight, where he's coming off that main event knockout loss against Song Yadong, and they've reset him against a very tricky fighter to beat, and maybe Bautista bounces off this fight and, sets himself up for a great fight and a run to the top, or to at least a main event himself. But as much as I really wanted to get there with Bautista, especially because he's an underdog in this fight, currently around +130, I really wanted to get there for Bautista, and I really wanted to like him as an underdog, but I just couldn't get there. I do think it's going to be a tough fight for him. And look, Bautista's got in my opinion, shall we say, power advantage in this fight. I did want to say striking advantage, but we've seen Ricky Simón strike well against other strikers. I mean, he didn't against Song Yadong, but Song Yadong's a different level of striker and a different level of boxer with power himself as well. And we've seen Ricky Simón, like I say, do well with the striking. He's got good technical striking himself, with the wrestling in mind, to use the strikes to set up the takedowns. The difficulty with Simón in this fight, the only thing that concerns me, is when Simón does lose against these power guys, he tends to lose by knockout. And that's a little bit of a concern, because with Mario Bautista, he genuinely does have some power, and he's not like this KO artist that's knocking everybody out, but he does have explosive power. And Simone has been knocked out numerous times. So that's the one concern here. But the thing is with Simone, it's that relentless pressure wrestling. I think with Ricky Simone, we've got a very good idea of the types of fighter he struggles against. We've got a ceiling with Simone. We know that he's not going to be a champion. We know that he's going to struggle against the top end of the division, but against anybody lower than that top end of the division, I still think is a nightmare fight for everybody. And Bautista right now, in my opinion, is at that level that's just lower than the top end of the division. And I think that Ricky Simone's style, his relentless pressure, his wrestling, he can go hard, remember, for 3 rounds without any issues whatsoever. And I just think that he's going to smother the game of Bautista. I think it's going to take him maybe 30, 60, maybe 90 seconds to feel his way into this fight. That's a window of opportunity for Bautista. But after that, I think it's just going to be shooting takedowns at Bautista. Bautista's got decent takedown defense. He's also got decent jiu-jitsu as well, both offensively and defensively. That will help him at least in the initial parts of the fight. But just like we see time and time again with these pressure wrestlers, eventually you break your opponent to the point where they've got up 4 or 5 times already, and then suddenly they're getting taken down more frequently, a little bit easier, they're getting held down for a little bit longer. And whilst all this is happening, the pressure wrestler, all they're doing is just taking over the fight. And I kind of feel that although Bautista, in my opinion, is the more well-rounded and skilled fighter from a well-rounded perspective, I just don't think he's going to have the opportunity to really fight his game here because of the way Ricky Simone fights. And Bautista's got no problem trying to keep up with pace and pressure. It's just, I don't see him defending the takedowns, getting back out in space, lighting Simone up, defending any future takedowns, creating space so the takedowns are coming more desperate from a little bit further out. I just don't see Bautista being able to do that for a full 15 minutes. I think it's going to be another smothering performance from Ricky Simone. But like I said, in between all, the pressure wrestling and the takedowns, especially early on in this fight when the reads are being made, there is going to be a window of opportunity for Bautista to maybe land something, maybe even land a knee, as Ricky Simone's shooting him for a takedown if he's testing the waters early before getting his reads in. There is a small window of opportunity for Bautista to land that knockout, but I just don't think that comes to fruition here. I do think it's Simone that has the, like I said, very smothering performance with the relentless pace, the pressure and the wrestling. So for those reasons, I'm picking Ricky Simone to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is going to be a fun, powerful fight. We've got Phil Hawes versus Brunno Ferreira. Now, it's also a very volatile fight as well. Like, you look at everything from the outset, both fighters have got insane power, knockout power, one-punch knockout power. But Brunno Ferreira's coming off a knockout loss where he was knocked out badly against the newcomer Nursultan Ruziboyev, a fighter that I actually bet at, I think, at around plus 175. I did like Ruziboyev in that fight. And with Phil Hawes on the other side, he's coming off back-to-back knockouts over the last couple of years. Real bad knockouts, by the way. He's got 5 losses. 4 of them have come by knockout. So for as powerful as Phil Hawes is, there's definitely a big question mark on the durability. But the thing is with Ferreira, he's coming off a bad knockout as well. So it's definitely a volatile fight. 2 hard hitters against 2 fighters that are coming off knockouts. Now, the thing is with Phil Hawes, I feel like he's just less trustworthy at the minute. Look, that was Brunno Ferreira's first loss. I kind of feel that Brunno Ferreira was unbeaten at that point. He's been wiping through everybody, even on the regional scene. And he comes in for his UFC debut, big underdog, knocks out Gregory Rodriguez, who is, at this point, a UFC veteran, a solid fighter everywhere, knocked him out badly. And I kind of feel that Brunno Ferreira will have gone into that Ruziboyev fight being overconfident, thinking that he's unbeatable, invincible, and he's got caught. I do think that even if he'd admit it or not, I don't know. I definitely feel that there was an element of that, or there would have been an element of that. Coming into this fight, though, I feel like it will have reset him a little bit, refocused him, and I think that with Phil Hawes, it's definitely a better time to fight Phil Hawes now than what it would have been in the last fight. If he fought Hawes instead of Ruziboyev, is what I'm trying to say. With Phil Hawes, I kind of feel that, look, in 2022, he was knocked out badly by Roman Dolidze. You know, if you remember that fight, he hurt his knee with a knee bar, I think it was, or a heel hook. And the fight wasn't stopped. He was stood back up, and then Dolidze ended up knocking him out badly. You know, it was quite unnecessary damage in the end. He could have potentially gone down from the body shot after that, rather than taking all the damage to the jaw, to the chin. And then he took the right amount of time off. He came back in 2023. He fought Ikram Aliskerov, again another top fighter, and he was knocked out badly again. This time he's taken the right amount of time off again, and he's coming back against another powerful puncher. I do worry for Phil Hawes. And like I say, it's not as if those back-to-back losses were the first 2 KOs that's happened to him. 4 out of 5 of his KO losses 4 out of 5 of his professional MMA losses have come by the way of KO. So, yeah, it's tough. Now, you look at the other elements of this fight, it's not all about striking. We could have wrestling, we could have grappling. Brunno Ferreira's got decent wrestling. Phil Hawes has got better wrestling. When it comes to the jiu-jitsu, Phil Hawes has got decent jiu-jitsu. Ferreira's got better jiu-jitsu. So I kind of feel like the wrestling and grappling, if we do see it in this fight, sort of is nullified on either side, because I do think it's more likely for Hawes to get the takedowns. But if he does, I think Brunno Ferreira's jiu-jitsu is going to be good enough to get back up and not, he doesn't settle on his back. He's really good at scrambling and getting back up to his feet. But again, if we do see Hawes go into the well with the wrestling too much, that's where his cardio can get drained. Hawes seems to be fine when he's striking. Weirdly, for someone with a wrestling background, his cardio's better when he strikes than when he wrestles. When he starts over wrestling, then that's when the cardio can start draining, dipping quite a lot. And again, to me, that just gives another advantage to Ferreira in that scenario. But I do think it's going to be a fight on the feet. And the other thing with Phil Hawes as well is, look, the amount of time that we've seen Phil Hawes come out in a fight, do really well, look really sharp, really put the strikes together and the combinations together well, and then suddenly, bang, he's switched off and he's gone. It's just another concern. The 2 concerns I've got with Hawes is he can start great and he can look great in a fight all the way up until he's not looking great and he's knocked out. And then the second of all, the fact that, look, he's been knocked out 4 times from his 5 professional loss, and the other loss was a submission loss as well, an area where Brunno Ferreira is good also. So, yeah, it's not so much... The pick here is, I'm sure you could understand at this point, and, after listening to the breakdown, that I am siding with Brunno Ferreira from a pick perspective, but I feel that it's not so much Brunno. I'm picking Brunno Ferreira because Brunno Ferreira's outstanding. I do think he's a very good fighter. It's just more of the real concerns that I've got with Phil Hawes around the durability and getting finished and looking great until he's not, and all that sort of stuff. I just don't think it bodes well, especially, go back and watch those last 2 knockouts that Phil Hawes has suffered. They're really, really bad. And yeah, it's more, the pick is Brunno Ferreira, but it's more because of Phil Hawes than Brunno Ferreira, if that makes sense. So for those reasons, I'm picking Brunno Ferreira to win this fight. And in the next fight, we're in the heavyweight division. We've got Andrei Arlovski versus Waldo Cortes-Acosta. And I do think that this fight is a bit of a passing of the guard type of fight. I genuinely think Arlovski's time is very limited at this point. I think it is coming to an end. He's a legend of the game, a legend of the sport, a legend of the UFC. Anybody that's watched MMA for long enough will understand exactly what Arlovski's done in this sport and how respected he is as a fighter. But, Father Time waits for nobody, and it happens to every single fighter in this sport. Those that are good, those that aren't as good, eventually it comes a time where, you have to retire. And that's not just this sport, it's every sport. And I genuinely think that it's not going to be long now for Arlovski. And this fight, I think, is a very difficult fight for him. Now, to back up what I'm saying, he's coming off 2 losses. Marcos Rogerio de Lima choked him out after putting a bit of a onslaught on him early in that fight. I don't think de Lima's a bad loss for any fighter in the division, though. I think de Lima's a really good fighter. But then last time out, getting knocked out by Dontel Mays, and again, I don't mean to be disrespectful, and I don't mean it in a disrespectful way, but Dontel Mays isn't the type of fighter that should be knocking out the top fighters in the division. So the fact that he's knocked Arlovski out, I do think that that's a sign that Arlovski is now very visibly declining. You go back and look at Arlovski's last 4 wins in the UFC. You've got Chase Sherman. We all know about Chase Sherman. Carlos Felipe, no longer with the UFC. Jared Van Dere and Jake Collier, he won by split decision. And I'm telling you now, the Jake Collier fight, he did not win. And the other fights have been so close at this level in the UFC. Again, after those 4 wins and the being that close against fighters that are at the bottom of the UFC division, shall we say, to then go on 2 back-to-back losses, I just don't think Arlovski's there anymore. And the thing is with Waldo Cortes-Acosta, he's a young, hungry fighter. He can take damage. We saw when Waldo Cortes-Acosta fought Marcos Rogerio de Lima. I actually bet de Lima in that fight. I thought it was going to be a pretty clear-cut win for de Lima, but the first 2 rounds were obviously really good for de Lima, but then Cortes-Acosta was coming back, and that was after taking a significant amount of damage as well. So Waldo Cortes-Acosta's young, he's hungry, he's durable, he moves well for the division, he's got really good volume, he's a fighter that can put real hard, fast combinations together as well. He moves not like a heavyweight, shall we say, he moves more like a light heavyweight / middleweight. So I think it's a tough fight for Arlovski, because Arlovski tends to be cruising through these fights where he can set the pace, he can set, how fast the fight's going, dictate where the fight takes place, and make fights close by slowing everything down. But with Cortes-Acosta, I don't think he's going to be able to do that against him. I think Cortes-Acosta will be the one setting the pace, pushing forwards, racking up volume. Then there's the power aspect as well. Is Arlovski's durability finally cracked? We'll find out for sure in this fight, but I think it's a tough fight for Arlovski. I don't think he's going to be able to scrape a split decision win. I think that Cortes-Acosta is going to put in enough volume in this fight to, really pull away with it. And then I still think that he's got the finishing upside in this fight as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Waldo Cortes-Acosta to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is a good fight stylistically. We've got Matheus Semelsberger versus Preston Parsons. Now, both fighters are very good in very different areas. So Preston Parsons is definitely the grappler in this fight. That's where he excels, but he's a well-rounded fighter as well. You've got to hand it to him. He's got decent striking. It did look like he hurt Trevin Giles for a moment on the feet striking in his last fight. A fight where I bet Preston Parsons there as an underdog, and I kind of feel that, I was on the wrong end of that sort of split decision against Trevin Giles. But then Matheus Semelsberger, he's a fighter again that's relatively well-rounded, but it's his striking, and this dude has got freakish power as well. Like, he can be losing a fight, but one punch can just change absolutely everything. And he's not the type of power puncher that's going to wing big overhand bombs or big winging hooks. He's a fighter that will throw straight punches. He's got good technical striking, but the power that he packs behind his punches is insane. So, look, from Preston Parsons' perspective, with the grappling, he's got to get his wrestling going. Now, from the outset, you look at Semelsberger, he's been taken down before. You look at the fight that he had with Jeremiah Wells. He lost that fight even though he dropped Jeremiah Wells badly twice, and he still lost the fight, and that was because he couldn't stop the takedowns from Wells eventually. Wells was taking him down, controlling him on the mat. Semelsberger couldn't get back up, and yeah, it was a fight where you look at that and think, okay, well, can Preston Parsons replicate that performance from Wells? And I'm just not convinced he can. The reason why is, look, Wells is a legitimate Daniel Gracie BJJ black belt. Like, when he's on top of you, fighters are going to struggle to get back up to your feet. And if you do try and get back up to your feet and in the wrong way, then they'll capitalize on a bad get-up, look for a choke, get you back down. And then when you look at the wrestling, Jeremiah Wells is a very explosive fighter. He's got a ton of power. He will explode into these takedowns. And even when you do analyse the wrestling of that fight, Semelsberger actually did a decent job of defending a number of takedowns before Wells ended up getting the better of him. And what I could see in this type of fight is I could see Parsons doing really well in round one, getting the takedowns, controlling top position for a little bit. But again, Semelsberger's got decent defensive jiu-jitsu and he can get back up to his feet. But I do think Parsons will have a good round one, but then what I think is going to happen is I think he's going to have to hit maybe 2-3 takedowns in that first round, maybe chain wrestle and get Semelsberger down that way. And Parsons' cardio does tend to drop a little bit when he's wrestling. Like, he won't gas out to the point where he can't function, but you can visibly see his cardio decrease the longer it takes to take his opponent down. And I think he'll use a lot of his cardio in that first round to have a good round one. But then I think that Semelsberger's going to come good after that. Semelsberger's got really good cardio. I'd be shocked if he tired out in this fight. And I do think the longer the fight goes on, it's one of these types of fights where it's more likely going to drag on and pull on in the favour of Semelsberger. I think the one thing the Parsons does on the feet as well, he does like to be aggressive also. And I think if he gets into a firefight exchange with Semelsberger, I do think Semelsberger finds the home for that punch as well. Parsons is a little hittable himself, as aggressive and good with combinations as he is. He can leave his head on the centre line. So, yeah, look, if I'm wrong here and Parsons is able to have a couple of good rounds with the wrestling and the top side grappling, then he wins this fight. But I just think that it's typical and reminiscent of one of those fights where the grappler's going to have one good round and then the fight's slowly going to start slipping away from them. And then when you add in Semelsberger's freakish power to go with that, yeah, I think it's a bad combination. Both fighters are well rounded here. Semelsberger more of the striker, Parsons more of the grappler. But I do think that the defensive wrestling and grappling of Semelsberger is good enough at a certain level in the UFC to prevent a fighter from running over them. And I think that level of fighter is Preston Parsons. For those reasons, I'm picking Matheus Semelsberger to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Marcus McGhee versus Gaston Bolanos. Now, Marcus McGhee, in my opinion, is a dark horse in the UFC. I genuinely think that he's a fighter that, you watch tape on him, he's so well-rounded. He's a little bit like what I've just mentioned with Semelsberger. He's got that crazy power, but then he's got decent wrestling, decent grappling as well. He can use it both offensively and defensively. And I just think he's going to be one of these fighters that is just hard to beat. And eventually he will get beat in the UFC, he'll get high enough in the rankings if he does get that far and somebody better than him will beat him. But at this level, I think that he's a dangerous fighter to fight against because he can take the fight anywhere. Even if you go to the mat with this guy, he's got good scrambles, good jiu-jitsu. And Gaston Bolanos is a fighter that went very close with Aaron Phillips last time out. And apparently Bolanos and Phillips had trained together before as well. So, look, I don't mean any disrespect to Phillips, but he's not a UFC caliber fighter in my opinion. I think he's he'd be a very good regional level fighter, but in the UFC, I just don't think he quite cuts it. And Gaston Bolanos went very close with him, and they knew each other as well. So I don't really have too much to go off with Gaston Bolanos in this fight. Like, where does he win? Look, he's small-ish, and he's got that thick build, that thick physique build. He's got power. He could land on Marcus McGhee and knock him out. That's always a possibility with any fight. 4-ounce gloves at this level in the UFC. So he's got the knockout potential, but how likely is it going to be that he knocks out McGhee? I think he's going to have to stand and trade with McGhee to land that punch on him that knocks him out. And in an exchange, I'd just prefer McGhee over Bolanos. And then when you look at the wrestling and grappling, I just don't think Bolanos has got anything for McGhee there. So it's a tough... McGhee's going to be a difficult fighter to beat in general. And then stylistically, I think it's tough for Bolanos as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Marcus McGhee to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Farid Basharat versus Taylor Lapilus. Now, Taylor Lapilus surprised me a lot against Caolan Lochnan last time out. I bet Lochnan in that fight as an underdog, didn't quite pay off. But Taylor Lapilus showed me that he's a very well-rounded fighter. This is a fighter that's predominantly a kickboxer. You can see that, but he's got really good defensive wrestling. He can get back up to his feet. He's got good cardio as well. And like I say, he's a dangerous striker. He's got that short, thick build with good cardio, good combinations, good volume, it seems. So Lapilus is a decent fighter. I just think Farid Basharat is just a level above what Lapilus has faced previously. And Farid Basharat is... Look, as good as Lapilus' takedown defense was against Caolan Lochnan, and it was very good, most other fighters would have crumbled under that type of pressure from Lochnan. But Basharat's got a different level of wrestling. He won't be desperate for it. He won't force it. He'll look for the entries in the open mat, whereas Carolan Lochnan, as an example, does much better against the cage chain wrestling, a bit like Colby Covington. But Farid Basharat will look for the open mat takedowns, and I think that's where the difference is. And Farid Basharat will hit those reactionary. He won't go out there specifically to look for them because his striking's good enough to be able to compete at this level against any fighter in the UFC. And I think this is where Taylor Lapilus is going to get stuck a little bit in this fight, because if Lapilus, even if his wrestling and defensive wrestling and grappling is on point and the fight's won and lost on the feet, I still don't think that Lapilus is a better technical striker than Basharat. I think Basharat is going to be a lot smarter in the cage. I think he's going to be more aware with what he throws. His efficiency is going to be good. And I think that Lapilus will be there with him, striking. I don't think that Basharat's going to whitewash him on the feet. I think Lapilus will be there with him. But I think Basharat will just land the better strikes, slowly pull away, slowly take the edge off each round, but then you add in the potential of the wrestling and grappling in there as well, and then that starts to allow Basharat to pull away fairly comfortably in the fight. Like I say, Lapilus is a fighter that I think is a great fighter. He's very good in the right areas where he needs to be. But these Basharat brothers, I think at the minute, are just on a different level, and I think we're going to see. And I'm pretty sure I've said this about every Basharat fight, but I think we're gonna continue to see Basharat wins from both Farid and his brother until they get to a very high level in the rankings, and that's when we'll see them take the first loss in the UFC. I think that in this specific fight, Lapilus is going to provide a good matchup for Basharat. He's going to test him in some areas, but I think it's a test that Basharat passes for sure. So for those reasons, I'm picking Farid Basharat to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Westin Wilson versus the newcomer Gian Silva. Now, straight off the bat, look, Silva's the biggest favourite on the card, minus 800. I don't think that a UFC newcomer in Silva against someone that is awkward to fight in Westin Wilson should be a minus 800 favourite. Of course, I fully understand why he is the favourite, and I kind of understand why the line has got so far wide in that respect, but I just don't agree with that line movement. I do think that Silva should be the favourite. Maybe it should be a minus 400 favourite, but up at minus 800, it becomes almost unplayable for a UFC debutant. And look, like I said, Westin Wilson, he isn't the best fighter at this level in the UFC. He's definitely got flaws in his game. He can definitely be got at for sure. But regardless of what you say about Wilson, he's a very awkward fighter. He's like 6'1", 6'2" for the division. His base is grappling, and having that sort of frame, like his takedowns don't seem to be great. But what he can do really well is clinch against the cage, start wrapping up a leg, get a hook in against the cage, and then drag his opponents down. Because he's got that tall frame, he's got the ability to make it really difficult for his opponents with things like getting your hooks in against the cage and, you know, body locks and all that sort of stuff. And I think that that's where he's really awkward. And if he went into, all I'm saying is, look, if Wilson goes into this fight and survives a little bit, or weathers a little bit of a storm early on and clinches up with Silva, gets a hook in, drags him down to the mat and chokes him, I am not going to be shocked. When a fighter's minus 800 and that happens to them, you should be shocked. And I just wouldn't be. And I don't think anyone else really would be either. So this is what I mean about the betting line. However, you know, let's go back to how this fight realistically plays out. Gian Silva's small. He's like a bull. He's going to come forwards. He's aggressive, packs power in combinations. A very explosive Brazilian. Again, another fighter within this explosive Brazilian era. And you look at Westin Wilson, he gives up range when fighters are overly aggressive. He doesn't really have the best defense. He's got some of that tall man defense. He can get backed up at the cage and, you know, have shots and combinations be fired at him. Because he is so tall, one thing that is going to allow for Gian Silva to do is to work the body as well as the head, a little bit like how John Lineker used to do it. You know, when the hands are up, go to the body, then the hands come down, you go to the head. And that's ultimately how I see potentially Gian Silva knocking Westin Wilson out. I do think Gian Silva's going to win the fight. I don't like the tall man defense. I don't like the durability aspect. Joanderson Brito knocked Wilson out in a very weird way when Wilson attacked the leg. But again, just flipping back over to the other side, Gian Silva is not, Joanderson Brito is not anywhere close to him. Westin Wilson at least had some submission threat against a fighter like Joanderson Brito. Obviously, Brito got out of the leg, the leg submission and, started landing the punches from top that knocked him out. But what I'm saying is Wilson had moments in that fight against a much better, a very similar type of fighter to Gian Silva, but also a much better version. So if he's having moments against Brito, he could have moments here. Again, just playing devil's advocate, I do think Gian Silva wins the fight, but all I'm just trying to make the case of is, look, minus 800 is a daft number for Gian Silva making his UFC debut against an awkward and tricky fighter like Wilson. With that being said, though, I think Gian Silva gets into that range, lands the combinations inside boxing range, causes a problem for Wilson, who does somewhat have bad defensive striking with that tall man defense. I'm picking Gian Silva to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got UFC newcomer Tom Nolan coming in from the Contender Series versus Nikolas Motta, who's actually got a quick turnaround fight here after what happened against Trey Ogden last time out. Of course, that was another controversial moment. Trey Ogden controlling the fight, comfortably beating Nikolas Motta, and then, of course, got Motta in the submission attempt, and the referee prematurely stopped the fight, which we're actually seeing more and more of. Like, I can't ever remember prior to maybe 2 years ago ever seeing this happen, and I've now seen it like 3 times in the last year to 2 years. I can't remember how long, but it's happening more and more frequently. And again, it caused a no contest because Motta wasn't out, but it was one of those fights where, look, Ogden was likely going to take him out with that submission, and if he didn't, he was going to win on the scorecards anyway. So yeah, real unfortunate for Trey Ogden, and Motta got away with one there. But you look at Motta's fights in the UFC, he's 1-3, got knocked out against Jim Miller, then he was knocked out against Manuel Torres, then of course, like I've just mentioned, comfortably getting beat by Trey Ogden, and even in the one win that he had against Cameron Van Camp, who isn't, again, no disrespect to UFC caliber fighter, he was actually got at a little bit early in that fight before he found the knockout as well. So here against Tom Nolan, again, we've seen this a million times. The argument for Motta in this fight is, how many times have we seen a Dana White Contender Series fighter make his UFC debut at around 5-6-0? He's minus 300, minus 350 on that debut against a fighter that he shouldn't have too many troubles with, at least on paper, and then the experienced fighter ends up coming out with the win. We've read this story a million times over, but again, I don't know whether I'm just being naive and falling into that story again or not, but look, Tom Nolan's going to have a 6-inch height advantage, he's going to have a 6-inch reach advantage, he's powerful, he's explosive, he's good on the mat as well, and I kind of feel like, look, Motta's got another very difficult fight here. I think that for Motta to actually get involved and get to the point where he's going to be really efficient and effective, he's got to get inside of that reach and range. And I just don't think he does that well enough. Like, he can be aggressive at times, but I do feel that there's an element of doubt in Motta in himself as a fighter. I don't think he's active enough, and his movement is quick and erratic enough to be able to get inside of that tall range that Tom Nolan's going to have. And therefore, Nolan should be able to, for at least the majority of this fight, or for as long as it lasts, be able to keep Motta on the outside where he can just strike well, straight punches, good kicks, beat Motta up a little bit, and then start turning it on the more and more he beats him up from that outside. Maybe start closing the range yourself, get into the clinch, land some knees with, a Muay Thai plum clinch, something like that. But I just think that Motta's work rate and his self-belief is not there enough for him to be able to really effectively close the distance and start taking the fight to Nolan. I think Nolan's going to be too powerful, too explosive, and he's going to have the control of the range as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Tom Nolan to win this fight. And in the next fight, the final fight to break down, we've got a fun one here in the flyweight division. We've got Felipe Bunes versus Joshua Van. Now, Joshua Van, super impressed with Van in his last fight. I actually bet Kevin Borjas as a pretty decent underdog. I don't regret the bet. I'm sure I got Borjas at like plus 200 or something, and you know, he did what a plus 200 fighter needed to do and just fell short. But the thing is, Kevin Borjas in that fight beats the majority of fighters in the division. Like, that wasn't a typical debut fight coming from the Contender Series. That was a legit fighter in Kevin Borjas, and Van had trouble early on. He was hurt. He didn't give up on himself. He didn't quit. He got back into the fight, recovered well, and really started to put the pressure on Borjas. And even Borjas, who I said leading into the fight, and I still believe it now, he's a fighter that does fight well on the back foot as well as the front foot, but Van made it that difficult for him with the way he pressured and his volume, that Borjas really did struggle in large moments in that fight on the back foot. And the thing is with Bunes, like, if you watch Bunes, Felipe Bunes is a good fighter. He's got aggressive striking himself. He's got good technical striking, but he's also got a good grappling game. Like, he's a well-rounded fighter. Again, very typical of this new Brazilian era of a fighter that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. But what Bunes doesn't do well is striking when he's on the back foot, and I think this is a real problem for him in this fight, because Van will push forwards, he will move forwards, he will put the pressure on his opponents. He's that type of fighter that, you know, you get these types of fighters in the UFC where you just know that no matter who they're against, they're going to be the one moving forwards. And at least at this level in the UFC, Van is absolutely that type of fighter. So without even seeing the fight, I know that Van's going to have a lot of success moving forwards in this fight. And I think Bunes is going to be on the back foot. I think he's going to struggle a little bit striking off the back foot. Because of that, I think that Bunes is going to not be too successful with his wrestling, because he does have good wrestling, but again, it's kind of dependent on him being the fighter that's moving forwards and being aggressive himself. So I kind of think that all these tools that Bunes has is going to be whipped away from him with the forward pressure of Van, and that's where it becomes a real issue. Of course, we've seen Van hurt, we've seen Van dropped, so we know that he can be got at himself as well. But I genuinely think that Van has just beaten a much better version of Felipe Bunes, especially from a striking perspective. I think that, you know, you stick Borjas in there with Bunes from a striking perspective, and Borjas absolutely lights him up. And because I kind of feel that Van's going to take away any successful wrestling and grappling attempts from Bunes, that it is a fight that is going to play out with the majority of the fight playing out on the feet. I just think that Van's so much better than Bunes, and I think that Van's just beaten a better striker in that respect in Borjas than what Bunes is. So for those reasons, I'm picking Joshua Van to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast, the first one back of 2024. As I said right at the start, I cannot wait for Saturday night, sitting down, watching fights, watching the UFC. I actually think it's a low-key really good card as well. I feel like there's going to be a load of finishers. Fighters are going to be making their opponents pay for dipping out on the Christmas dinner a little bit. So, yeah, look, I can't wait. Thank you for tuning in as always and listening to the breakdowns. If you are tuning in, even if you're listening on one of the podcast platforms like Apple Music, Google Music, or Spotify, anywhere, you can jump onto the YouTube channel and do us a favour and subscribe to the YouTube channel, as that's what really helps us. If I've ever helped you with a breakdown, analysing a fight, winning a bet, then, you know, that's the way that you can repay me. And of course, if you want to jump in on the action, on the betting action on Saturday night as well, then you can do so with plenty to offer on the MMA Play 365 website. Different packages, different levels of subscription, all really priced very well. You know, it's nothing too crazy. You're not having to break the bank for a package, and then you can win that money back and profit on top as well. So if you are interested and you want to jump in on the action, on the betting action this weekend, make sure you hit up MMAplay365.com. And that's all from me, Newsome. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you again next week.